Welcome back to the MercyCast. And if you have not liked or subscribed to this podcast, I want to challenge you to do it. I want to encourage you to do it. Maybe not challenge you, because that sounds, I don't know, that sounds a little tiny bit negative. I want to encourage you because you know what? When you do that, we get this thing out there. So with that said, let's dive into the show. The MercyCast is where we are learning the art of compassion through life's adversity. And today, we're really going to tap into that idea because all of us, whether we know it or not, sometimes we prioritize comfort over growth. Sometimes we prioritize happiness over growing as a human being and growing together with other sufferers. And so today, I'm really excited about bringing on Shawn Nowotnik, the author of the new book, F Happiness, The Search of Meaning in a World Gone Mad, Chasing Happiness. He's a filmmaker, he's a therapist, and he lives outside of Chicago. You know, for Shawn, everything seemed perfect in his life. He was thriving in the entertainment industry, and he had just been offered a chance to direct his first film, a documentary. But in the same week, his teenage son tragically died by suicide. I am so honored to have Shawn on. Shawn, welcome to the MercyCast. Could you help me understand kind of what was going on as you were processing everything that was happening in that moment?
Well, it was such a strange time. I think loss is, it's probably one of the hardest things, if not the hardest thing to overcome or even try to understand in the moment it happens. And to think about that it was at what I thought was the apex of my life, right? I was doing great in the entertainment industry. I was about to direct the movie. So I was actually at an all-time high where I thought like, wow, life is really going great. So this was the complete opposite. This was a total crash and burn of my existence. And I just know that it felt surreal when it happened. And when I heard the news, I couldn't even acknowledge it. I felt I was disassociating like this. I'm not hearing what they're saying, what they're telling me. And this isn't my life. This is not what I signed up for. This is not what I was planning. This is not happening.
Would you say not being able to accept the reality of what was happening?
I think that would be very true. Yeah, it was. I just couldn't accept it. And without being too graphic, until I actually, visited my son where they were holding him, I just couldn't wrap my brain around it. Like I just thought there was some kind of mistake. There had to be some kind of mistake because he was generally a really happy kid, loving, super soft-hearted person. It just didn't make any sense to me.
For something like that, I don't have words, right? Like when we suffer that deeply, especially in times where we're having these really high highs too, it is so much to try to grapple with. What did it look like for you as you were moving forward? And I don't mean that in a trite way. I don't mean getting past. I mean like waking up, putting clothes on, and going outside, trying to live again.
Well, I can tell you that was about a 2-year journey for me. I'm not going to lie. And I don't think I left the house for 2 years, really, except for essentials, absolute need to go out. And I avoided therapy myself, which is ironic because now I'm a psychotherapist. And it was actually my sister, so this is the blessing of family. I think we have 3 great commodities in our life, and that's time, our health, and then our family. I think those are our 3 greatest commodities, right? Time, we don't know how much we have. Health, of course, we all need health to spend that time. And then family. And it was because of family, my sister prodding me to go get some help and go talk to somebody that I actually wound up going to a survivor of suicide meeting. And I didn't particularly love the meeting, but what I did enjoy was the fact that I made some people laugh with my stories about my son, because people were talking about the tragedy of the end of their, siblings or partners or children's lives. And I was talking about the beautiful things that I loved about him and the funny things he would do, like, sneak out of the house, out of the upstairs window or something, which would frustrate me at the time. But then later, so he can go skateboard. But I felt something really wonderful when I made other people laugh and feel some kind of break from this pain they were in. And it was because of that group, actually, ironically, that I didn't want to go to, that people kept asking me to go to the group. So I was like, okay, I'll go a couple more times. I'll go a couple more times. And then people were seeking me out saying, you know what? You should be a therapist. You're a good listener and you have really great insight into this. And I was like, wait, I'm an entertainment guy. I'm a Hollywood guy. Like even though I'm not doing anything right now except being, depressed, that's not my life. And the weird thing is, call it divine intervention, call it the universe speaking to me, whatever applies that someone can understand, is I couldn't sleep at night. And all I kept thinking about was that. So the next day I got on to Google and I was like, what is required to become a psychotherapist? And then I looked at it and I was like, I could do that. I probably could do that if I could wrap my head around stepping away from trying to, do something in the entertainment industry. That was the big thing, is like, can I let go of this thing that that's been on hold for 2 years? And when I finally did let go of that, I think it was like a week later, I was signed up for school. And it was lucky too, because the next school semester was going to start in like 2 weeks from when I initially contacted them. So everything it was like the universe just lined up for me. It was like, I looked, I found some schools, I got accepted, and school was starting in 2 weeks. So I didn't have much time to think about it. It's like, are you doing this or are you not doing it? And I just had to go with it. And I thought it was would be the best use of my time and the pain that I was suffering if I could bring some levity to other people's lives.
Why did you focus on those funny stories?
Because I think there's a lesson to be learned in meaningfulness. And I think those stories have meaningfulness that I shared. And I don't want to just talk about tragedy and the pain or what the last moments of that person's life was, though that's, obviously that haunts me in some ways. But I think there's great value. I would say it's one of the best medicines is laughter, and to remember these, meaningful, joyful moments. And I don't know. It was weird. It was like I was swimming upstream in that group because so many people were talking about how tragic everything was. And I was trying to still see some beauty in the world, even though I was, massively in pain. I just couldn't get away from that. I guess it's something ingrained in me where I have to just try to find the best in the situation. And I think the other thing is, for me, it was also a survival thing, right? Like I need to try to think about, the beauty of his life, that there was great value while he was here, rather than just focus solely on the tragedy.
This is something that we find in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. There is a focus historically, especially from psychotherapists, on this idea of meaning. But sometimes we don't know what meaning means. And so could you help me understand, like, what do you mean when you bring up meaning? I feel like I said that a lot.
It's okay. It's interesting you mentioned Viktor Frankl, because I mention him, and I don't know what chapter it is, either chapter 3 or 4 of my book. Every chapter I give like a little story about someone historically or currently who's really lived the life that wasn't always easy, and that there was a lot of struggle, but yet it was meaningful. So I always give this example between happiness and meaningfulness, because I think there's a confusion of like, if I'm happy, that means I'm having a great life. Where I think if you're having a meaningful life, then that's what's important. So look, I'll give you just a funny example where I think everyone could understand this. So happiness, that thing that most of us are searching for, but we should be really searching for meaningfulness. And then I won't beat you over the head about that anymore. But so happiness is ordering a pizza. It shows up to your door in 30 minutes or less. It's hot. It looks great. It tastes great. You enjoy it. But the problem with that is 30 minutes later, you're wondering what's for dessert and what you're going to watch on Netflix. So it's very fleeting. Happiness is fleeting. So here's the difference I'll use the pizza again with meaningfulness. So for meaningfulness, Meaningfulness is having that same exact experience, except you're surrounded by loved ones, family, friends, your best friends, beloved colleagues, and you're sharing meaningful conversation that's going to transcend time. You're going to think about it a day later, a week later, a year later, maybe even 10 years later. You'll remember how you made them feel and how they made you feel. You might not remember the exact date, but you'll remember that. And that's meaningfulness. It has this value that transcends time, and it's deeper than something superficial that's fleeting. And that's the difference. Like, purchases aren't usually meaningful. Now, granted, if you spent your whole life searching for a rookie Mickey Mantle card, I'm sure there's great meaning because you've researched it, you've tracked it. But just going out every week to buy like the latest fashion thing, that's not really meaningful for most people. I don't think it would be. And I would say it isn't. And that's the difference. Is it's meaningfulness is just, it just hits all the right things in us. And it's the best thing for us. And we can do meaningful things even through pain. See, if we're just focused on happiness, we can't accomplish a lot of things. Like, for instance, if I needed to be happy to go into work every day, well, I wouldn't be going into work every day because you're not always going to be happy, traffic or whatever it is. But meaningfulness, what the greater good you're serving, which is also often helping other people, we can get through really rough times, and we can accept the difficult parts of our journey because it is meaningful, because the overall goal is worth it. And the existence, even being in the present time, is worth it. Not just what we get in the end results, but what we're getting in the moment.
And I think there's a move even culturally towards this, where people, rather than giving people the newest technological gadget or whatever that's going to be outdated in 3 weeks, people are gifting experiences. And I think for me, that's something I love, is when friends don't necessarily give me gifts, but say, you know what? Let's go to this restaurant, or man, let's go on a trip, or something like that, where there's something bigger outside of us that you can kind of connect to. And I'm a big fan. I've talked about it on the podcast a good bit, of this idea of pilgrimage. And I've been on pilgrimages throughout northern Spain, where you see people who are Christian, you see people of other faiths, you see people who would not ascribe to a faith, but everyone is looking for meaning. And I think that is something that we desperately need, but we seem to get stuck looking for happiness. We seem to get stuck looking for the highs when we're in the lows. How do we avoid this trap?
Well, I can tell you one thing that's really important, as a component we haven't touched on yet, is to be meaningful. Like, we can have meaningful moments, but to really have a meaningful life, you have to know who you authentically are. So I talk about that a lot in the book, right? I literally beat people over the head with the concept of authenticity and what that is. And a lot of people don't know who they are. Because if you think about our school system, for example, in the US, I don't know how it is other places around the world, but in the US, we're taught from a young age, line up outside the door this way, we walk in this way, we sit this way, we have to follow rules, we have to raise our hand a certain way, and we're only celebrated if we get the gold star, right? So it's very conforming, and we're taught to be, even so much so as we're not even taught how to think anymore, we're taught what to think. So where's the authenticity in that? How do you become authentic when you're already told everything that you're supposed to do and everything you're supposed to think? And then we have things like our parents, which I think most parents try to be wonderful parents and do their best, but parenting is a learning process. I don't know, for the listeners out there, I'm a parent myself, and I can tell you it is a learning process. We try our best, but no child goes unscathed, right? So if we use terms like, oh, be more like your older sister or your younger sister or your smarter sister or your smarter brother, this can be damaging to kids. So they get in this narrative that they are less than someone else. And then again, it's hard to find authenticity, because now you're carrying that forward, and we're our own worst enemies in our mind. And we just think, well, this is the lane I'm supposed to stay in. So to find meaningfulness, to answer your question more in depth, is you first have to know who you authentically are. You can have moments of meaningfulness without that, but if you truly want to live a meaningful life, you must absolutely know who you authentically are. And I could tell you the best way of doing that is to sit down, make a list, old fashioned style, get a pen and pencil, or if you really have to use your smartphone, you can go in the notes section and write down what your core beliefs are. There's so many people who cannot, if you just ask them, what are your core beliefs? They'll look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, no, what are your core beliefs? Because your core beliefs will lead you to being, that's what will get you to being authentic.
And I love that. I love that this is something that you're getting to, because I do think authenticity matters. And I think we come off the most inauthentic when we are in denial, we're running from something, we're running from who we are. And then we end up kind of living for external validation or approval. Would you agree? Would you disagree?
Absolutely agree with you on that. So that's really great that you mentioned this. So the other thing is, often we get happiness from external factors. Oh, you did a great job. Like I said, the gold star. Oh, I love your outfit. You look so great this way, or you did a good job. And that's nice to get compliments. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying let's not compliment each other, because that's a wonderful part of life, but we can't live for that. So what you tapped on was really important, is internally, we have to find value in what we're doing. We have to believe in what we're doing. We have to challenge, of course, our core beliefs. They're going to change, right? Like, I hope people's core beliefs, I hope some are like set in stone that are really important. Like, hey, I'm not going to steal from other people. I believe in servitude towards others, and whatever it is, right? I hopefully that won't change, but there are other, core beliefs that, maybe we should rethink, or we learn about something different and we challenge our thought patterns. We go, you know what? Maybe this one I could toss out of this list, or I need to, let it help it evolve. But I think that's really important, is internally to feel comfortable in what you're doing,
Right.
because there's nothing worse than being disingenuous. And then someone likes you or dislikes you for someone you're not actually, that's not really who you are. But the problem with that is, it's going back to, I think a lot of people don't know who they are. And I could tell you this as someone who's out there in the dating world, people on average, don't know who they are. They don't know what their core beliefs are. They're not even sure what they want. They want happiness, but they don't even know what the definition of their version of happiness is. I just want this feeling, this constant dopamine rush, which dopamine's not a bad thing, but I just constantly want that, like I get from the like button and everything else on my social media. And that's not really long lasting, like meaningfulness in going to that. The other thing I would like to circle around to, if it's okay, is I think we're missing one other component too. So I think it's really cool to recognize that we internally have to validate ourselves and choose to do certain things for internal reasons, not external. But the other thing about authenticity is, when we're authentic, the really awesome thing that comes out of that is we can be vulnerable with people, because we feel comfortable in who we are. And if you want to talk about the best relationships you probably had in your life, or if you think about them, it's times where you're able to be vulnerable with other people and be honest with them. And that's when the magic really happens. And I think that's why authenticity is so important. Then you could be vulnerable, and that will help you live a meaningful life, and a life that, with less regrets. I think we'll all have some regrets. Like, of course, we all often say, I should have, would have, could have, but we have less regrets because we're living authentically.
At the end of the day, when we are looking for ideals, we will never settle for what's real. And I think we all have this desire deep within us. It's just embedded in there, where we wish that the person that we are with would love us for who we are. And you tapped into that, I think, when you mentioned this idea of vulnerability, because of course that's where we find meaning, because now that person loves me. They don't love the idea of me. And how do we get from that idea of someone to the reality of someone, whether it be a significant partner or it be friends or community or a church or a social group, how do we get to that idea of reality versus concept?
Wow. Well, I guess one is keep talking about it on shows like this, right? That's the one thing, is to get people to recognize that. Yeah, I think it goes back to people needing to accept the contradictions of life. That life isn't always going to be wonderful. Everything's not going to be perfect. If you expect it to be like a TV show or a movie, prepare for great disappointment. I'm sure there's some people out there literally living the Cinderella story, but for most people, that's not reality, because none of us are perfect. So we're going to have good days and we're going to have bad days. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Like, how do we, because I wouldn't want to tell someone, well, just settle for someone, but I think it's like, be realistic in what you're asking of someone. And the question that you'd have to ask yourself is,
That's good.
do I meet the
That's
same
good.
value that I'm trying to acquire in a person? So, right. So I think there's a lot of people out there like, well, I want Mr. or Mrs. Perfect, and they need to have XYZ credentials. They need to earn this much. They need to do this. And it's like, ask yourself, well, why is that important? Because I think if you really look at our society and you talk about external things, think about the number one thing that gets you on a magazine cover. Usually it's you make a lot of money in your career, you're really successful in your career, right? So they have the best-selling artist on the cover of a magazine, or the news story, or you're the richest businessman. So we have all these ideals that you have to have. These things are important criteria, and I don't think that has anything to do with having value as a human being. And so a lot of times we're looking at these other factors that are not as important. So again, that goes to core values and what's important. I think the other thing is to give people some grace. Like, so, we talk about red flags, right? So when you talk about relationships, whether it's friends or dating or other, people are always like, oh, there's so many red flags. It's like, what makes a red flag? That's what sometimes I ask people. They're like, well, it's just a red flag. I'm like, well, how do you know it's like, what makes this a red flag? Like, because to nine other people, this isn't a red flag. So I'm just trying to understand. And some people can't even define why this is. Like, well, that's what it is. That's the expectation in society. It's like, yeah, but does that fit your criteria? I'm not concerned about the rest of society. How does it fit your criteria? And why do you think it's a red flag? Not that you're influenced to believe that it should be a red flag. Like, certainly, red flags,
Right.
if you're abusive, I think that's a red flag. I don't think we need to argue that, right? There's no debate on that. But I think red flags of being like, someone has a child or something, or they don't have the same education as you, or they don't make as much as you. Like, I don't really see that as a red flag. I see that's really superficial, reasons to kind of say someone, because a red flag, signifies something bad, right? I don't necessarily see it that way. So yeah, I think it's really complex. But here's the one thing I can tell you, and I know I kind of run around your question. I can tell you the one way to have the best relationship, and this, I don't care. So listeners, take your pen out here. My belief, the number one thing to any relationship, whether it's business, friendship, family, or significant other, partner, husband, wife, whatever it is, spouse, is communication. So what you're talking about, when I heard your question, the first thing I think is like, one, you have to communicate to yourself what your needs are and what your desires are and what's really important to you. And two, you need to express it to other people or ask them the questions, right? Because if we don't communicate, we make assumptions. And when we make assumptions, it leads to resentment. So the more we can communicate, the less we assume, the less resentment we have in life. I really think it's that simple. I think if we had more communication in the world, and I mean kind, loving, peaceful communication, not what we see in the news media between politicians, attacking character and all that. I'm talking about saying like, hey, this hurts my feelings and I feel this way about it. Not that you're a bad person and you made me feel this way. It's like, I feel uncomfortable when you do this. Can you explain why you do that? Because it does hurt me, hurts me in some way. And I think if we did that again, then we don't assume like, that they're just a mean person or they just don't care. Sometimes people don't even realize that they're not doing or living up to expectations. So I think communication is just so important for any kind of relationship. And again, that communication with yourself as well. And that communication should have grace as well. So I think that's a big thing. I always tell people, speak to yourself the way you would speak to a best friend. Give yourself grace, be kind.
We say things to ourselves that no one would say, but we repeat it. We just keep repeating it and listening to it over and over and over. And we're listening to ourselves. We're not talking to ourselves. And I love how you're saying, no, don't do that, because I feel like that comes with perfectionism. And you talked about idealism. You talked about looking for the perfect person to the point that we overuse this idea of red flags, like we're some amateur bullfighter, and we're missing the idea that maybe life and meaning isn't found in the perfect. Maybe that's never been the goal for us. But you talk about how communication helps us unlock really what's going on. And those vulnerable moments where we say, hey, this scared me, or I feel uncomfortable, or can we talk about it? I found those moments, they are messy. They aren't the things that I would put on a holiday card, but they are the things that you kind of come together and you go deeper and your bond gets stronger. And how would you say that we can address perfectionism as we're kind of going through this process of finding meaning?
Well, it's interesting because I struggle with this myself. I'm sure many of your listeners do, because we're taught, again, like going back to school, gold star, you're good. You fail, you make a mistake, you fall down, you're bad, right? You're not in the good pile. You're not getting a gold star or the silver star for the follow-up if you're not as good as the gold star, right? Oh boy. So perfection. So I like to think of what Dale Carnegie said, and I won't quote him because I'll just totally destroy his quote. But basically his concept of that failure is not the end all, that it's a great opportunity for learning and growth. And as long as every time we make a mistake or we think we failed, it's not really truly a failure if you get back up and you learn from it and you grow. And it's one of the best learning lessons. I don't know about you, but boy, if I make a mistake on something, I remember that. And like, I really try hard not to do that again. And I learn from it. And I think in business and in life and relationships as well, it's a great tool. So the idea of perfectionism, it sets us up for being really uncomfortable in life because we're kind of tiptoeing around. So we talk about authenticity again. It's like a lot of times our idea of perfection is based on external, what other people think. Right? Am I good looking enough? Am I the right weight for other people? Am I smart enough? Am I good enough? Am I worthy of these people? And it's like, that's not a healthy way to start. Going back to what you said earlier, when, the way we talk to ourselves is like, I think about Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. If I think I'm no good, well, then I'm going to act as such and believe it as such. And my opportunities then become less because I'm not going to accept maybe that job offer or that interview for something or that date or whatever it is. So yeah, the idea of perfectionism, I think we really need to step away from that. And I think that's not saying like not being your best. I think it's important to try to be your best. But we should be setting our own barometer. I don't know who said this, and I don't know if anyone knows, but there's like a quote out there that I've seen, and it says, don't use someone else's ruler to measure your life.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's really profound, right? So I think when we talk about perfectionism, often we're looking at external. A lot of times it's not like, well, how can I improve myself? It's like, well, how can I be like somebody else, right? Like keeping up with someone else. Well, they did this, so why am I not doing this? So I need to do it. And it's like, and there was another similar saying where someone said, don't compare your first quarter to someone else's third quarter in life. And it's like, that's really profound as well. It's like, again, we look at perfection and we say, well, why am I not there? Well, that person, let's say you're running a race, they might have been training for 4 years already. I mean, you can't expect to be at the same caliber as someone like that who's really become efficient at what they do and a master of their sport. They also might just be generally just faster. That's just the reality of life. I think it's okay to look at other people. So what I'm not saying is, I think it's great to look at mentors or other people that are succeeding and say, I want to be like them, but not to want to be them. Not to say that I'm good or bad based on what someone else is doing, but look at that as inspiration to become better. So I really don't subscribe to the idea of perfection. Still trying to tell my brain that, because my brain keeps saying like, why aren't you perfect? Why aren't you perfect? Why aren't you perfect? And I got to tell myself, well, I'm not perfect, but I'm going to do the best I can. And that's good enough.
We get to determine our goals and what we aspire to. And that doesn't mean we don't try to be the best versions of ourselves, but the perfect version, that's unattainable. That can be a lot. And then I loved how you mentioned this idea of don't compare yourself if you're in the first quarter with someone in the third, but kind of just try to look at it from a different vantage point. There's a philosopher that I follow from time to time. And this philosopher, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, said this. He said, you can be one day I'm going to do this. One day I'm going to meet this goal. Or it could be day one. And it's so cliche and trite, but I find myself reflecting on that sometimes, because I'm like, you're right. I don't have to be perfect in this, but I can start. I can go for that. If that's something I want to do, let me try. And the pearls of wisdom that we get from Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I mean,
yes. That kind of reminds me of the saying of, when's the best time to plant a tree? And, the answer is 20 years ago. When's the next best time right now? And that goes back to the idea. So I will say one thing, the opposite of perfectionism, I would say, is procrastination. So that's a huge thing that a lot of people, when you touch base on, today's the day, perfectionism doesn't help us, but putting things off is just terrible. It just destroys any momentum we have. It keeps us from growing. Procrastination is just this really terrible thing to have in our life, and so many of us do it. I was at a party once in Hollywood, and I met Dr. Phil, and I was talking about something, and Dr. Phil's like, "Oh, so you're talking about dreams?" And I was like, "No, I'm talking about my goals." He's like, "No, you're talking about dreams." I was thinking to myself, "Dr. Phil, I think you're wrong here. I'm talking about goals." And he said, "Shawn, do you know the difference between dreams and a goal?" And I couldn't answer that. And I was like, "Oh, darn it. He's got me. He's trapped me," right? It's like I'm in a chess game with this guy, and he's just already trapped me in move one. And now I can't even answer the difference between a dream and a goal. And I gave some answer, which was, I don't even know what it is, but I wouldn't agree with it now. And he said the difference between a dream and a goal is timeline and accountability. So to get away from procrastination and is to really set up a timeline and accountability, and then we achieve things, right? And that's how we get growth as well, because we can talk about it. I'm going to do this, and one day I'm going to do that. When is one day? I don't even know. Where's one day on the calendar? Because I never see one day. I see Monday through Sunday, but. So I think it's really important for anything is to set goals and a timeline and readjust if needed. Don't beat yourself up, but I highly recommend people who aren't familiar with the term to look up SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And if you want a game changer, and I mentioned this in my previous book, I just discussed SMART goals briefly for a couple of pages. Because once I started applying this, it works for everything. Whether you're trying to get a business loan, you'll answer whether or not you got a viable business and whether you should be getting a loan. If you're trying to lose weight, which I've used it for as well. Anything you're trying to, even writing a book, like what's your timeline and what's your accountability? Because I don't know about you, Raleigh, but when I first started writing books, I first started writing them in my mind, 10, 15 years ago, I'm going to write a book, which I never did because I didn't have a timeline or accountability.
Now I have someone expecting this, and now I'm like, okay, I got to manage the time. I got to make the time to make this work. And so, but when I get stuck in my perfectionistic impulses of, like I said, I'm a recovering perfectionist. when I get in this place of it has to be perfect, for me, that's when I start procrastinating. And that's when I stop meeting goals, is because I have to get it perfectly right. But then I'm trying to view that a little bit differently now. I'm trying to say, what if success for me was just getting it done? What if it was just to be good to my parameters, like to be as good as I can? But what if I were to leave the rest with the reader? That doesn't mean I just put garbage out there. No artist puts out garbage. They put their heart and soul into it. But when you try to make it perfect, you miss the subtle nuance that comes from the little failures, I think. Like, I think there is this thing you talked about, growing through failure, this idea of failing forward, which is also kind of combined with these small victories that we have when we set goals. I think there's something beautiful in how the failing forward and the small victories actually grow us as people. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so too. And I think you touched on a really important fact about the expectations of our work. I think any artist or any creative person, no matter what field you're in, even a business, like if you want to have the best of anything, your best version of your art, whether it's a painting, a song, or whatever it is, you have to do it for yourself first. And
Mm.
and the audience second. And I think there's a really great book out by Rick Rubin. I can't remember the title of his book. And I mentioned Rick in my book. He's a music producer, for those out there who are not familiar with him. He's worked with everyone from Paul McCartney to Slipknot to Tom Petty to the Beastie Boys to
Yeah.
Chili Peppers, LL Cool J. I mean, everybody. But Rick really puts forward this idea of like, let the art speak for itself. I don't care what the record labels want. I don't care what the executives want. I don't even care what the audience wants. I only care about making good art. And they'll either accept it or they won't, but we can live with that. And he even talks about, and when you mentioned the failure and kind of failing forward, he talks about experimenting with things and just trying things, and they will work themselves out if you give them the opportunity. It's when we try to force ourselves into creating something, especially for someone else, like you mentioned, we lose the nuances. We also lose the personality and the uniqueness of what we're creating, because now we're trying to cater to 5,000 or 50,000 or 5 million people, depending on your audience. That's a lot of people's input to want to try to produce something that's going to make everyone happy.
I recently listened to portions of a podcast where he was talking about that idea of creating for yourself and then trusting that people will come alongside. But if you create for them, I think at some point you will lose yourself, because it seems like at the root of that is there's this idea of comparison. There's this idea of external validation only, which external validation is fine in small doses. But I think when that is your goal, then you end up, whether you want to or not, pandering to what everyone else wants rather than being the authentic you. And I think somewhere in there we find meaning.
I think so. It's interesting because I don't know if other people are like this who write books, but you know, my previous book and this book that I wrote, of Happiness, I wrote them for me. I didn't write them for an audience. I mean, listen, I know I'm writing with hopes of reaching a big audience, but I actually write them for me. I pick topics that I need to improve on. And then if I think and if it's worthy, if I think it's something I need to improve on or I could learn from, or I really need to beat into my own brain, and I think it has value to an audience, then I pursue it in writing it rather than just simply researching it. So it sounds selfish, but I first am serving myself. And then I'm like, here, I think because I think I have value and I think I have good insight, which is maybe a little bit egotistical, but I think you have to have a little bit of that to create stuff. And I think, well, then there's value to other people, or maybe they will find value in it. And I hope they do. But if they don't, I already won because I've learned from this. I'm growing from the book. And then it is what it is. And again, I didn't cater to what I think the audience wants.
We all share this commonality, these same wants and desires and core needs and core issues, that you're almost free to really unpack the things within yourself that you want to deal with. And when you do something for yourself, ultimately there can be this altruistic thing that happens, because you aren't that different. Though you may think you are, we're not that different from everybody else. We have different issues, but we have issues. We're all trying to navigate life. And so I think there's a lot of grace. What you keep saying, Shawn, is when we're authentic, we're on the path to finding meaning. And so I think for me in these last moments, I really want to know, how can our listeners and how can I really focus on finding meaning?
Like I said earlier, I really think is first to look at who you are, what are your needs, what are your core beliefs, as I mentioned before, so you could be living an authentic life. Question your narrative. What am I doing now? What is the path? As I mentioned before, a lot of us are in this lane that we didn't really ask to be in, but we're told we're in this lane and we just continue to drive in it, and we've not really experimented too far out. Or the few times we did try to swerve out of that lane or change lanes, we got pushed back and we're like, oh no, I can't do it. I got to stay where it's safe. This is where it's safe. If people don't have low expectations of me, it's better than me risking, failure, right? Again, the perfectionism. So I think that's really important. Honestly, it's number one is authenticity. Find out who you are. And I know a lot of people are going like, they're probably listening going, yeah, Shawn, dummy, I know who I am. Like I'm showing up to, it's like, no, really think about it. Like, and why are you who you are? And is that who you want to be? And are you doing what is the best use of your time? So I think that's the other thing with meaningfulness is I think, again, going back to, if you could do anything that not just serves yourself, but serves others, I think that is, for me, at least me personally, that is what leads to a meaningful life. Not that what I did in Hollywood or the entertainment industry was wrong, because I did help a lot of people, but what I'm doing now has so much more meaning. It's so much easier to get out of bed every day because I feel like I'm really helping people. So I think that's important. And even simple things like, do a pros and cons list of like, why are you doing what you're doing, or should you continue to do what you're doing? Whether it's a job, or unfortunately, sometimes we're in unhealthy relationships. Question whether that's, I'm not telling anyone to get divorced or to break up, but, question, are these, even friends, like, are these people, are they toxic? Are they helping you grow, or are they holding you back? How are they influencing you? And I think the other thing is when we talk about, and you mentioned this earlier, is how do we talk to ourselves? We really need to change the way we talk to ourselves. I think there's this primitive thing, that's still with us as humans. And that was, we come from tribes, right? So we need to fit in, we need to fit in, we need to fit in, or we don't survive. Well, we can survive without being in a tribe. We're in social tribes now, but it's not necessary for survival, like, to have fire and shelter and stuff like that. So I think it's important to really think what your needs are and make sure you're fulfilling them. Because I think a lot of dissatisfaction, I don't know if you've ever seen this. I see it all the time on social media. I shouldn't say all the time because I try to limit social media, but every time I'm on it, people are whipping fries over the counter at a restaurant. They're screaming out their window, kicking people's mirrors on their cars. Right. These are people who are not living an authentic life. These are people who they are not living probably, or they're having a really freak moment where they're breaking down. Like, because when you're living a meaningful life, you're at peace pretty much with yourself and most of the universe. It doesn't mean you're not going to get frustrated in traffic. It doesn't mean someone's not going to do something that's unkind to you, but it's like you're really at peace with the universe. And I feel like if you are at peace with the universe, you're probably living a meaningful life. And it doesn't mean you have to be a Tibetan monk up in the mountains. You could still be down here, being a consumer, because I'm a capitalist at heart. So I'm not anti, by the way, because I said earlier, like, you can't buy happiness. I still think there's some wonderful things that can be purchased. So I'm not, anti-capitalist, but authenticity is number one. And that's what I try to drive home in the book, and meaningfulness. And to realize that going back to the perfectionism, is the journey is not going to be easy always. It's going to be rocky. I wouldn't wish my journey on anybody, but it turned into something wonderful. And I think about, you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and I mentioned him in the book as well. And he came up with man's search for meaning in his head, because he didn't.
Yeah.
It's not like he had a typewriter and they were giving a lot of time in Auschwitz to have oh yeah, sure, Victor, work on a book. No, but he realized that people needed hope. And I would say that's the other thing, is be hopeful. And how are you going to be hopeful? Well, you're making plans, right? We're setting goals. We're reevaluating what our needs are. There's so much to be hopeful for. Think about it. Like, almost, I would think every listener who's on this right now is able to turn on a faucet and get clean water. Like, that is not the entire world. That's first world countries. You're probably somewhere warm, or if you're in a cold climate like I am, you're warm, and if not, you're somewhere cool in a warm climate. Like, we have pretty good conditions. So let's have hope, and let's focus on what we can change, and that's ourself, and that's our mindsets, right? Again, going back to Descartes, I think, therefore am. If I think life is miserable and the world is ugly, well, I'm going to feel that way. I'm going to start to feel that. I'm going to start to feel the ugliness of the world. And there is some ugliness out there, but I like to believe in beauty and positivity and hope and stuff like that. And again, that goes back to Viktor Frankl from Man's Search for Meaning, where, this guy was in probably the worst. If there's hell on earth, that was Auschwitz, right? And this guy still held on to hope and was able to come up with a manuscript in his mind after losing everything, including family, right? So it's like, I think I can get through a hard day at work here.
As you were talking and as we were processing this episode, I think what we really need to realize is that the goal is not perfection, it's wholeness. And everything you said, I think, leads us to being whole. And I think that is a goal. So, Shawn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yes, thank you for having me.